Gainesville Mayor Harvey Ward is saying he's going to take action on GRU utility rates this week.
He made that statement in his first State of the City speech as mayor today. TV20's Ethan Badowski tells us if citizens agree with Ward's assessment of the city.
I thought it was very good.
Mike Warren left satisfied with Harvey Ward's first State of the City speech as mayor. In his address, Ward called the state of Gainesville strong and touted city programs he believes are successful. I spoke with a pair of citizens after Mayor Ward's speech and asked them if they agreed with his assessment that the state of Gainesville is strong.
If the city goes forward with important changes, and the number one important change is our housing pattern, if he can solve the tale of two cities, then he will accomplish something.
I think it is strong. I think we have all the building blocks to even make it stronger and to make, again, a great place to bring up a family. I'm a cyclist, so I'm very concerned about cycling and making sure that we can eliminate so many of the terrible tragedies we had with regard to pedestrians.
Despite his statement of strength, Ward acknowledged Gainesville faces many challenges. He says one of the largest concerns is financial burdens due to high utility rates.
Balancing the many financial pressures in our world is hard, and high utility bills cause stress and uncertainty for many in our community and across the nation. We are working with staff regularly to find ways to help.
Ward said at Thursday's City Commission meeting he will update people about how the city can provide assistance to those most in need. He did not get into specifics on what would happen, and the only item related to GRU in the agenda is about the solar contract. In Gainesville, Ethan Badowski, TV20 News.